Okay, perfect. So, okay, 25 minutes. I will try to be quick, to be fast. Maybe I need some minutes more, but I will be as quick as.
Yeah, don't worry. If you have 30 minutes, that's okay too. Don't worry.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I think I have like the tendency to talk a bit more, otherwise you have to interrupt me. And
Okay,
but yeah, thank you for having me here. Also, welcome everybody. I would like to talk to you today about the topic Bourdieu and class analysis in Mexico. And yeah, the structure for my presentation is that I would like to start to give you a little idea about my research interests and my projects. Then I will go on to give you a general overview regarding social structure and class research in Latin America and Mexico, to focus then as the next step more closer on the reception and the role of Bourdieu's sociology in Mexico, with a special focus on class research, and at the end, some conclusions. Yeah, to my background, I'm a researcher of Mexican and German origin. I studied at the University of Göttingen and in Jena, sociology as well as economic history, and my focus have been always social inequality and social classes in the global south as well as in the global north. Right now, as Maxime already told you, I'm working at the University of Osnabrück regarding topics of class and digitalization. But today my focus will be more on my PhD thesis I just handled in, and where I work on social classes and habitus types in Mexico within a qualitative research project focusing on intergenerational class research, doing interviews with Mexican families, several generations. And within this PhD thesis, I also worked a lot on the Bourdieu reception in Mexico and the general development of class analysis in this Latin American country. And my insights from this work I will present to you today. Maybe 3 questions will be important for me today for the structure of my presentation. First question, what is the role of Bourdieu sociology in Mexican class research? Did his sociology have an important impact on the research of social classes as it have in other regions in the world? And maybe even more important, are the theoretical concepts developed by Bourdieu for the analysis of social classes in France also useful for the analysis of class relations in a country like Mexico? For the beginning, especially for researcher with a European background, maybe face a quite paradoxical situation in Mexico. On the one side, we have high levels of social inequality. So you actually could expect that there is a lot of class research in Mexico. However, there are comparatively little class research in this Mexican country, and there are also good reasons why. So I'm not sure if you are familiar with Ulrich Beck, the German sociologist, and his individualization theory. However, Beck says that normally the class concept in Germany is a zombie because academics hold on to it. However, people's in daily life don't use it anymore to understand their life experience, etc., etc. So it is a zombie because only academics hold on to it. In Mexico, we could actually say that people in daily life in Mexico use the class concept a lot to understand their relations to other people. However, in academia, it does not ever always have the same importance. I will have with you a closer look on the reasons why and some general developments of the social structure and class analysis in the region. So with this graphic, it's in a graphic, handmade graphic by me. It's not based on statistical information, but I wanted to give you with this visualization a better impression, an easier impression of social structure analysis in Latin America. So I tried to divide the class research in 3 periods, going up and going down. So with ups and declines. So we have a first period after the Second World War from the 1950s to the 1970s, 80s. This period normally is referred to as the process of institutionalization of sociology in Latin America. So sociologists at this point experience that their society is in transition from agrarian to more industrial society. Other people say that they are transition from traditional to modern society. And so people try to capture with their concept this transition, and so ask themselves, who is the actor who is transforming society, who is giving an impulse for change. And so we have here competing theories from modernization theory, dependency theory, or even Marxist theory, who focused on middle classes, working classes, or peasants. And here we have a first rise of class analysis. And normally the different sociologies are marked with the analysis of an ethos of political engagement. However, from end of the 1970s and 80s, we can see a rapid decline in class research in Mexico and Latin America. Among others, we have some external factors as the debt crisis that led to a new problematic. So politicians and academics start to focus more on poverty than inequality. We also experience military dictatorships in many countries in Latin America. Many sociologists are persecuted, and people start to wonder more of how they can return to democracy, instead of focusing on class differences. Also, we have neoliberal globalization in the 1918s with the dismantling of some collective institutions. So the working class also lost political representation at the political field. All these factors led to a decline in the class analysis in Latin America. However, sociologists like Olvera and Girola from the UAM Azcapotzalco in Mexico, they also mentioned that there are some internal factors, not only external, that lead to the decline of class research in Latin America, internal to the academic field. So they called the second period the period of professionalization of sociology. People start to be disappointed with the prognosis of the grand theory, like modernization theory or Marxist theory. So people start to focus more on micro theory, methodological correctness, empirical studies, so on, so on. And by this, they also start to use new concepts, for example, social movements instead of social classes. And they say basically social movements like indigenous movements or feminist movements have been important also before, but we didn't see them because we used other concepts. So we didn't see the importance of this movement. And this is a period where also a professional ethos developed by sociologists. However, at the beginning of the 2000s, we are seeing a slow rise again in the interest of class research. And among others, there's a persistence of high inequality rates in Latin American societies. People start to wonder, how could we explain this high inequality rates? And at the same time, there's some disappointment with the disappointment. What do I mean by this? So it's the second period was marked by disappointment with prognosis of grand theory. Here we have to a certain degree a disappointment with too strong empirical studies, micro-theoretical studies. So that among others, the famous Latin American Mexican anthropologist Luis Regada, for example, he says, okay, nowadays we know that we live in unequal societies. We have a lot of information, a lot of statistical studies, but why do we live in unequal societies? So what are the explanations? And in this context, people are coming back to the concept of social class to get some explanatory capacity, at least mid-range explanatory capacity again, and they're trying to catch up with international research on social structure analysis. So I think many things I just told you maybe will be quite familiar to you, to the development of sociology, and maybe some of you wonder, okay, why is Adrian telling us all this is the same in Europe? I think, however, that there are some exceptions in Latin America. So what is special in Latin America for me is that the decline in class research is a real radical decline. As people, as Solis said, sociology have been interrupted, class research had been interrupted in Latin America in this period. And I know that also in Europe, we have this decline in class research. However, you still have in in the US or in Europe, you still have models from Eric Olin Wright, you still have Erickson, Gosop, Portocarrero, and so on, who are developing new class models and concepts. In Latin America, you have this strong interruption. It have been really down at this point. So I think for me, this is one peculiarity. on the other side, we also have theoretical peculiarities. Dependency theory has been a Latin American macro theoretical approach, which also lose importance in this decline. And after the 1918 and with the process of professionalization, we see more and more national pathways. So people do not develop anymore so much Latin American macro theoretical approaches to understand of inequality. We have like more a Mexican sociology, a Chilean sociology, Argentinian sociology, and so on. So now let's focus more on the Mexican case and Bourdieu. For Mexico, so it's similar, as I just told you, for Latin America, more in general, maybe some few peculiarities. On the one side, the grand theory with most importance in Mexico, we can say, was Marxist theory until the 1980s. And sociology normally focused on political institutions and political actors, more on the authoritarian state in Mexico, and also some questions of democracy, questions of cultural phenomena we are more used to focus on nowadays in sociology, were normally studied by anthropology and not by sociology. I think this is important to have in mind when we focus on the Bourdieu reception in Mexico. So the authors I already mentioned, Girola and Olvera from the one at Catozalco, they state, for example, that in the decline of class research in Mexico, two conceptual changes have been the most important for Mexican sociology. And at the end of the 20th century, it's the conceptual thematical change from social classes to social movements, and from marginalization to informal sector and poverty research. So with respect to the beginning of interest in Bourdieu's work, it is at this period of decline where Bourdieu's work becomes of interest for sociologists in Mexico, because it's like a period of theoretical reorientation. There are many people who try to hold on to this political commitment and to the commitment of change, and who do not want to give up so fast also some important concepts of Marxist theory, and they start to study, for example, Gramsci, Althusser, and so on and so on. And in this period, they also start to discover the sociology of Pierre Bourdieu. Maybe the very first, or one of the very first persons to approach Bourdieu's work in Mexico, and who wrote an autobiographical, really interesting autobiographical article about her approach to Bourdieu at the end of the 1970s, and she was also a student of Bourdieu in Paris, is Isabel Jimenez, who explicitly made clear that she still had this political commitment, and she started to read Gramsci and Althusser. At this point, at the beginning, she was skeptical of Bourdieu because she thought that the French sociologist will focus more on social reproduction instead of resistance. However, she then started to be amazed more and more by Bourdieu sociology. And what makes Isabel Jimenez so prototypically for the Bourdieu reception in Mexico is that she focuses with Bourdieu sociology on the field of culture and education. So the field of education is maybe the most important and the beginning of the Bourdieu reception in Mexico. However, I will focus in my presentation on some key authors of class research who focused on Bourdieu. Among others, there are, for example, Nestor Garcia Canclini, with a theoretical approach to Bourdieu with respect to classes. Garcia Canclini discusses the relation of Bourdieu with Gramsci. He wrote in the 1990s an introduction to Sociología y Cultura. It's a Spanish version of Questions de Sociologie from Bourdieu, and he discusses Bourdieu's concept in this introduction, and also makes a quite interesting reception of his class analysis. I will look on this deeper in the next slices. Then we have around the beginning of the 2000s, another article written by Patricio Solís, who published this article in a book published by Isabel Jimenez. Patricio Solís, in comparison to Isabel Jimenez and Garcia Canclini, doesn't makes so much a theoretical exegesis of Bourdieu's work, but he conducts an empirical study to prove the applicabilities of Bourdieu's concepts. And now in 2015, we also have a work from Gonzalo Azarabi. He conducts class research in Mexico and who focuses on collective relational experiences. He does not make so explicitly Bourdieu reception, but he uses some of his concepts, and above all, Sarabi's work offers us some connection points with Bourdieu's work. This is why I think he is quite interesting. So, okay, 50 minutes, half time. Now I will focus on a more detailed discussion of the class researchers I just presented. I would like to start with Patricio Solís from the Colegio de México, Colmex. Patricio Solís' background is normally quantitative research on occupational classes and social mobility rates. He works with the EGP model from Erickson, Goldthorpe, and Porto Carrero. And in this article, he criticizes the theoretical exegesis of Bourdieu's work in Mexico. And he says that he wants to conduct an empirical study to prove the applicability of Bourdieu's concepts in Mexico. Therefore, he focuses on lifestyle differences of male adults in Monterrey. And yeah, he wants to analyze this lifestyle difference of male adults in Monterrey by using Bourdieu's concepts. And so he says at the beginning that Bourdieu explains lifestyle difference by the distance in the social space. So people with a high volume of capital are at the top and have a certain social and cultural practices, and people at the bottom have a low volume of capital and have certain social and cultural practices. However, also the composition of capital, especially the composition of cultural and economic capital, is important to understand the position in the space and so your cultural preferences. So Solís tried to prove this suggestions of Bourdieu to analyze lifestyle differences by using occupational class model with 7 classes. The classes at the top, like entrepreneurs or professionals, are people with a high volume of capital, and the classes at the bottom, like workers, unskilled, skilled workers, service proletariat, have a low volume of capital. And so he tried to identify statistical correlations between these occupational classes and the cultural practices of male adults in Monterrey by focusing on a quantitative survey. And to make the story short, he says at the end that Bourdieu's concept for him in Mexico are only partly confirmed because the vertical hierarchy, so the amount of capital, is relevant to understand the cultural preferences of people in Mexico. However, for him, the composition of capital is not so important. It is a bit not a very convincing argument, because Solís himself acknowledged that his occupational classes actually doesn't represent sufficiently the differences in the composition of capital. So the model wasn't fit or able to find also differences related to the composition of capital. And another point of Solís is that he says that in Mexico, we have to take into account not only differences in the possession of capital, but also processes of migration, because, for example, the professionals share the interest in traditional Mexican music with the lower classes, and this shows that they normally have a rural migrant background, and so we need to understand this rural migrant background to understand the cultural preferences, which cannot be explained by the possession of capital. However, Solís, among others, neglect Bourdieu's habitus concept in this class research, which maybe could explain also this social inertia of interest in traditional Mexican music. Yeah, so the vertical hierarchy for Solís in a deeply unequal society like Mexico is more important than the composition of capital. So then let's get to the next class researcher, Nestor Garcia Canclini from the UNAM in Mexico. His background are cultural studies and popular classes. He can be located more in the research of anthropology and Marxist Gramscian tradition. Gramsci played a big role in Mexican cultural studies quite before Bourdieu. And as I told you before, Nestor Garcia Canclini makes a discussion of the relation from Gramsci and Bourdieu in his works. It is more a theoretical discussion with a special focus on cultural domination and possibilities of resistance for people of the popular classes. Garcia Canclini highlights positively from the work of Bourdieu that Bourdieu contributes to class analysis by not only focusing on the field of production, but on the field of consumption as well. And by focusing on the field of consumption and cultural practices, he highlights he's able to focus other spots where class struggles are happening in society, and he's able to explain also social reproduction, and by using the habitus concept, also like an implicit consensus. So by the internalization of society through habitus, how an implicit consensus is established in society. So these are the positive things. However, Canclini also had a quite important critique against Bourdieu. He says that in comparison to Europe, for him, Latin American societies, Latin American capitalist modernization was not accompanied by by unification of the symbolic market. Latin American societies are marked much more by cultural heterogeneity. And so here the idea is that for Bourdieu, Bourdieu conceptualized culture as capital. And so you have one common culture, which could be expressed as capital, and people internalize this culture through their habitus. And at the end, that leaves only space for an unequal appropriation of the same cultural capital and struggles for distinction. So people at the top have a lot of this cultural capital, and people at the bottom are only conceptualized like an impoverished version of the upper classes. And Garcia Canclini says, no, in Latin America, due to the history, we have different groups with different cultural capital, which is not deductibility. So it cannot be reduced to the other cultural capital. And people have their own aesthetical criteria. They do not only have functional criteria to evaluate consumer goods or so on. They also have like own aesthetical criteria. This is not only a right of the privileged classes. And even more important, the differences in the cultural capital in Mexico are also a basis for political movements. So for him, the problem is that with Bourdieu, there are impoverished versions of cultural capital, but there's no alternative popular culture with own aesthetical criteria. Yeah, here with this image, I just wanted to show the cultural heterogeneity, which also can be the background for political manifestations. However, Garcia Canclini himself also wants to not overemphasize the capacities of resistance. So is there no need for a Bourdieusian class analysis in Mexico? We have seen the arguments of Solis and of Canclini, who both only partly confirmed Bourdieu. For Solis and Bourdieu's capital theory is important to understand vertical differences. Canclini said that it is important in Latin America to connect to a relation of Gramsci, to focus on resistance, and to use Bourdieu to understand reproduction. But we have to combine both of these academics. Okay, at this part, I will try to focus like on a different way, where I see some possibilities of applying Bourdieu's concepts in Mexico. And I will start with a critique from Gilberto Jimenez, another sociologist who works in Mexico on the Mexican cultural studies. Gilberto Jimenez, he come to the conclusion that in the cultural studies in Mexico, which have been highly influenced by the Gramscian tradition, normally focused on popular classes as a valued alternative to the rest of the system. And they conduct research on popular classes as they being culturally independent and completely different group from the rest of society. So normally we'll see that there's a lack of research in Latin America who focused on the relation between classes, between popular classes and privileged classes. And there's also a lack of research regarding the internalization of culture in Mexico, for example, as with the habitus concept. So even if we find some research on popular classes in Mexico, normally we have little research on privileged classes, urban classes, or middle classes in the urban spaces in Mexico, which have been neglected in the past. And normally we can see that there is a more implicit populist perspective when conducting research on popular classes. So I have here a quotation, but regarding the time, I will skip this quotation from Bustamante and Garcia, who also makes a critical evaluation of cultural studies in Mexico. And I will come to the end of the presentation, but by finishing with presenting to you the work of Gonzalo Sarabi. I will locate Sarabi and research on social exclusion and urban studies in Mexico. So Sarabi, for me, is part of a network of people who normally do research on gated communities, urban poverty, or, for example, also the unequal access of citizens to public institutions in Mexico, with a high focus on reproduction of inequality, and using, for example, also concepts like moral symbolic boundaries in their work, or even the concepts of symbolic violence. And we can observe in this field interest in social classes as well as on relational collective experiences. For me, Gonzalo Sarabi presents one of the most promising research on social classes. In his book, he asked the very interesting question of how is it possible to live together in societies that are so profoundly unequal, like the Mexican society? And he had actually a quite contra-intuitive answer to that. For Sarabi, the high inequality in Mexico leads to a social fragmentation, so to a rupture, so that inequality penetrates all areas of social life in Mexico and goes quite far beyond only gradual differences. What do I mean by this? By differences in income. So inequality in Mexico is not only a question anymore of who have more income or who has less income, but it is the inequality penetrates all areas like schools, city, the use of the city, the institutions, different classes, approaches, so that we have actually, we see the appearance of class-specific life worlds. And in this class-specific life worlds, for sometimes you can forget about inequality. So Sarabi uses an antagonistic class model. He compares popular classes with privileged classes in Mexico, focusing on their collective experiences and practices in daily life in areas like school, city, and also consumption. And what is quite interesting that he understands class as relational. So we have to understand the existence of popular classes in relation with privileged classes, and they understand them that classes have like a multi-dimensional character. So you can't only explain classes by their occupational class, but you have to understand them by the experiences in school, the experiences with city, with consumption, and so on and so on. So the emergence of class-specific life worlds in Mexico can have some homogenizing effect on your life world, and that can help that you forget about class, because privileged classes are physically absent of the life world of popular classes, so you are not permanently confronted with it. However, when people confront each other many times, it becomes quite violent. So I think Sarabi offers us with his class concepts a different approach to social classes in Mexico. with this focus on relational experiences, subjectivity, and social cultural practices. And what is quite interesting is like the existence of the other class is constitutive for the existence, for example, the existence of the privileged class is constitutive for the existence of the popular classes as well. So Arabi always says it's not about comparing apples with pears. We have to understand the roots here in the unequal, highly unequal society and the different fruits at the top, and understand the relation this fruit has with the root, and in this relation to understand them. So I think in comparison to the model of heterogeneity, this is an alternative concept which is still sensitive to the rupture in Mexican society, but especially for urban spaces, we can study here also the relation of privileged and popular classes. My only little critique to Sarabi would be that his classes until now are still overly homogeneous. So we still have two blocks confronting each other with the popular classes and privileged classes. And until now, I think that in Mexico, further differentiation is needed so that we can also understand differences within the privileged classes and within the popular classes, even also in highly unequal society. And so I share with you some insight of my work. It's really work in progress. And I just wanted to give you an impression of what I mean, but I'm working on this now after the finishing of my PhD, is so that I'm trying to identify different habitus types within the Mexican popular and privileged classes. So at the top, we see the privileged classes. At the bottom, we can see some popular classes. I'm just working on it. This is only work in progress. But yeah, at the top, we have some habitus traits like self-confident. I really like the work of Annette Lareau, who uses the concept of sense of entitlement. I like this for the upper classes. And at the bottom, we have more fatalistic attitudes or a sense of constraint. However, we also have a horizontal differentiation where we can differentiate between more individual experimental attitudes versus a stronger sense of community or conventional attitudes. And yeah, so here I'm starting to work on it and to differentiate privileged and popular classes in Mexico by conducting a habitus analysis. But for now, conclusions. We can state that Bourdieu is of central interest in Mexico. His main focus is not class research, but more educational research, I would say. However, there are also class researchers, important class researchers, that represent different strands of research, as Solis with occupational classes, Canclini with his Marxist Gramscian tradition, or also Solis with the study on social exclusion and urban studies, who are interested in Bourdieu. And here Bourdieu becomes important at the beginning, first for researchers who still hold on to Marxist theory and a political commitment, and later plays a significant role with people who have a renewed interest in the concept of class and at least mid-ranged theory at the beginning of the 21st century. For me, the concept of social fragmentation is a quite interesting starting point to develop a research program on social classes inequality in the urban areas of Mexico. However, I think there's a lot of work still to do, especially on horizontal differences where the concept of habitus or maybe even the composition of capital can play a greater role. So thank you.